There is a moment in some people's lives that almost nobody sees. A quiet moment. No dramatic announcement, no long explanation, no public goodbye. Just a slow realization that something inside them has changed. And then, one by one, people disappear from their life. Friends stop receiving replies, messages remain unopened, invitations quietly fade into silence. From the outside, it can look cold, even confusing. Some people whisper that they became distant, others assume they became arrogant, bitter, or selfish. But the truth is often much more complicated than that. Because when someone cuts everyone off, it is rarely about hatred. Most of the time, it is about exhaustion. Not the kind of exhaustion that sleep can fix, but the kind that builds slowly over years. The kind that forms when someone has spent too long feeling misunderstood, unheard, or emotionally stretched thin. Psychologists sometimes describe this as emotional overload. When a person constantly adapts to other people's expectations, their mind eventually begins searching for a way to protect itself. And sometimes, the simplest form of protection is distance. Think about it. Most relationships in life run on invisible agreements. We listen when we are tired. We laugh when we are not amused. We say yes when we quietly want to say no. These small compromises are part of being human. But for some people, those compromises slowly pile up until something inside them begins asking a dangerous question. What would happen if I just stopped? Stopped explaining, stopped fixing, stopped being the person everyone expects. At first, the thought feels uncomfortable, almost guilty. After all, humans are wired for connection. Studies in psychology show that social belonging activates some of the same reward centers in the brain as food or safety. We are not meant to live completely alone, and yet something strange happens when someone feels emotionally unseen for long enough. Connection begins to feel heavier than solitude. Conversations become draining. Expectations feel overwhelming. Even small interactions begin to carry invisible pressure. So the mind starts doing something fascinating. It starts simplifying. Instead of trying to repair every relationship, it quietly begins asking another question. Which of these connections actually bring peace? And that is when the shift begins. Because many people who eventually cut everyone off did not start out distant at all. In fact, they were often the opposite. They were the listeners, the helpers, the ones who stayed a little longer in conversations because they cared about how others felt. But being that person comes with a hidden cost. When someone becomes the emotional support for everyone around them, they often forget something important. Who is supporting them? Over time, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. One day, they notice they are always the one reaching out first, always the one trying to understand, always the one making emotional space for others. And slowly, a quiet thought begins forming in the background of their mind. Maybe I should make space for myself instead. But here is the part most people misunderstand. Cutting people off is rarely a sudden decision. It is usually the final step of a long internal process, a process filled with small disappointments, quiet realizations, and moments where someone hoped things would change, but they didn't. And the most fascinating part is that psychology actually has a concept that explains this shift. It is called boundary awakening. This is the moment when a person suddenly becomes aware of the emotional limits they should have had all along. At first it feels empowering, but it also creates a new problem. Because once someone learns to recognize emotional imbalance, they start seeing it everywhere. In friendships, in family dynamics, even in casual conversations, and that awareness changes how they experience the world. Suddenly, Interactions that once felt normal begin to feel strangely uncomfortable. And this leads to a question that many people who withdraw from others quietly wrestle with. A question that sounds simple, but carries enormous emotional weight. What if the peace I've been searching for only exists when I'm alone? And the answer to that question can completely change the direction of someone's life. But what most people never realize is that the real psychology behind cutting everyone off goes even deeper than emotional exhaustion. Because sometimes the decision to walk away from everyone is not just about protection. Sometimes, it is about identity. And understanding that part reveals something about human nature that most of us never notice until it happens to us. Because at some point, the question stops being about other people. It becomes about who you are when nobody is watching. When someone cuts everyone off, they are not only stepping away from relationships, they are also stepping away from the identity those relationships created for them. For years, many people unknowingly play roles in other people's lives. The dependable one, the cheerful one, the problem solver, the listener who always understands. And those roles slowly become part of how they see themselves. But when someone finally steps back from everyone, something strange happens. Those roles disappear. Without the constant messages, conversations, and expectations, there is suddenly a quiet space where those identities used to exist. At first, that silence can feel unsettling. Psychologists often describe this as identity recalibration. When a person removes themselves from familiar social environments, the brain begins reassessing who they are outside of those roles. It is similar to what researchers observe when people move to a completely new city or change careers. The absence of familiar expectations forces the mind to rebuild its sense of self. But in this case, it happens internally, alone, and this is where the real transformation begins. Because solitude has a strange effect on the human mind. In small doses, it feels peaceful. In longer stretches, it becomes reflective. And eventually, it becomes revealing. When someone spends enough time away from the noise of constant interaction, they start noticing thoughts and emotions that were always there but buried under everyday distractions. Questions begin to surface. Questions like, did I actually enjoy those friendships, or was I just maintaining them out of habit? Was I being appreciated or simply expected? Was I showing up as my real self or the version that kept everyone comfortable? These questions are not easy to answer. In fact, many people avoid them entirely. Because the truth is, human relationships are complicated. They carry history, loyalty, shared memories, and emotional bonds that are not easily untangled, which is why cutting everyone off often feels extreme to outsiders. But to the person experiencing it, it rarely feels extreme at all. It feels necessary, like closing a door that has been quietly draining energy for years. However, here is the part that almost nobody talks about. Distance does not always mean permanent separation. In many cases, the period when someone cuts everyone off is not about rejecting people forever. It is about recalibrating. During this time, the mind slowly begins distinguishing between relationships that were maintained out of obligation and those that were built on genuine understanding. And when that clarity appears, something interesting happens. Not everyone stays cut off. Some connections return naturally, but they return differently, with clearer boundaries, with fewer expectations, with a stronger sense of emotional balance. Psychological research consistently shows that people who learn to establish boundaries often experience healthier relationships later on. Not more relationships, healthier ones. Because when someone finally understands their own emotional limits, they stop trying to be everything for everyone. They start choosing connections that feel reciprocal instead of exhausting, and that choice changes everything. But there is one final layer to this psychology that makes the whole process even more fascinating. Sometimes the act of walking away from everyone is not only about protecting peace, it is about rediscovering it. Modern life constantly pushes us toward noise, notifications, conversations, opinions, expectations, and in the middle of all that noise, it becomes incredibly difficult to hear something very important. Your own mind. Solitude, despite its reputation, is often where clarity lives. It is where people reconnect with forgotten interests, neglected thoughts, and parts of themselves that were slowly fading beneath the weight of constant interaction. This does not mean everyone should cut people off. Human connection is still one of the most powerful forces in our lives, but what it does reveal is something deeply human. Sometimes distance is not rejection. Sometimes distance is reflection. It is the mind stepping away from everything it has been carrying, just long enough to ask a quiet but important question. What kind of life actually feels peaceful to me? And when someone finally finds an honest answer to that question, they often return to the world a little differently. Not colder, not distant, just clearer about who deserves a place in their life and who does not.